She was almost home. The walk was short. The street was quiet. And then she stopped moving. No emergency call. No warning. Just a stretch of road that suddenly meant something else. By morning, the routine everyone trusted had turned into a crime scene. Her name was Jessica Callaher. Jessica was expected to make it home. Expected to respond. Expected to pick up life exactly where she left it. Nothing about that night suggested it would end differently. When she didn't arrive as expected, concern didn't come all at once. It came slowly, wrapped in patience and familiar explanations. Everyone assumed there was a reason. Everyone assumed there was time. Most people believe danger announces itself. With fear. With resistance. With something unmistakably wrong. This didn't. And that delay would shape everything that followed. The place Jessica was last known to be wasn't hidden. It wasn't remote. It was an ordinary stretch of street, the kind people pass through without thinking twice. Minutes passed, then more time than expected. And the longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to defend the idea that nothing was wrong. Someone else had crossed paths with her that night. Close enough to be part of the story. Close enough to influence how it unfolded. What investigators would uncover next would transform a delayed concern into a criminal investigation. This case wouldn't be defined by chaos. It would be defined by timing, and the narrow window where answers were missed. Timelines mattered. Movements mattered. And one short stretch of time would become central to everything. To understand what happened to Jessica Callaher, you have to look closely at that night, and how ordinary it seemed before it wasn't. Jessica was 27 years old. She lived in the Houston area, a city defined by scale, vast neighborhoods, long highways, constant motion. Within that expanse, Jessica's life was modest and personal. Friends described her as social but grounded, someone who valued connection and routine. She was not reckless. She did not disappear without explanation. She kept in touch. She showed up. Her days were shaped by familiarity. Places she returned to. People she recognized. A rhythm built over time that created the quiet confidence most people rely on without thinking about it. Trust was not something she analyzed, it was something she practiced simply by living. That trust mattered. Because nothing about Jessica's final days suggested she believed she was in danger. There was no dramatic break from routine. No sudden withdrawal from friends or family. No public record of fear. Whatever decisions she made in the days leading up to her death were decisions shaped by normalcy, by the expectation that the world would continue behaving the way it always had. She was last seen in the Houston area. The exact moment she vanished from view was unremarkable. And that is often how these stories begin. Not with chaos, but with quiet. When Jessica stopped responding, concern did not arrive all at once. Crept in slowly. Call unanswered. A message left unread. Time stretching longer than it should have. Those who knew her sensed something was off. Not because of a single moment, but because of absence. By the time authorities became involved, the question was no longer where Jessica was. It was what had happened to her. And as investigators began to reconstruct her final movements, they would uncover a truth that shifted the case permanently. One that transformed uncertainty into something far darker and far more deliberate. Because Jessica Callaher had not simply disappeared. She had been attacked. And someone had left her behind, believing she would never be able to tell her story. As investigators worked backward through Jessica Callaher's final known days, they focused first on proximity. Not motives, not theories, just proximity. Who had access to her time? Who shared space with her? Who could move close without raising concern? At 27, Jessica's life was not closed off. She interacted with people regularly. Friends, acquaintances, familiar faces tied to work and social circles. There was nothing unusual about that. In a city as large as Houston, overlapping connections are part of daily life. Among those connections was Crispin Harmel. Public records and later court proceedings would describe Harmel as an acquaintance. There was no long-term romantic relationship, no familial tie, no history that would immediately elevate him above others in Jessica's orbit. And that, in many ways, is what made the connection easy to overlook. Acquaintances exist in a gray space. They are familiar enough not to trigger alarm, but distant enough that their inner lives remain largely unknown. Investigators would later note that there were no documented threats, no restraining orders, no formal complaints tying Harmel to Jessica before her death. On the surface, nothing marked him as dangerous. No obvious red flags that would have prompted intervention. That absence mattered, because it shaped how the encounter that followed could unfold without resistance. Jessica was not known to place herself in volatile situations. She did not gravitate toward chaos. Her relationships, romantic or otherwise, were described as typical for someone her age. Social but not reckless, open but not careless. Whatever interaction occurred between Jessica and Harmel did not begin with fear. It began with familiarity. Investigators later emphasized this point carefully. There was no evidence of a struggle at the outset, no indication that Jessica expected harm. The circumstances suggested that she did not perceive immediate danger, at least not until it was too late. That realization reframed the case. Because crimes involving strangers often rely on force from the first moment, crimes involving acquaintances often rely on trust. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they examined where Jessica had been, who she had been with, and how those interactions fit into her normal patterns. They looked at phone activity, at reported sightings, at gaps that could not be easily explained. What emerged was not a story of chaos, but of opportunity. An opportunity created by access, by familiarity, by the absence of warning signs. And as investigators narrowed their focus, Harmel's name surfaced again, not because of speculation, but because of alignment. His movements, his access, his connection to the places Jessica had been. Still at this stage, the case remained cautious. No arrest, no public accusations, no conclusions announced. Just a tightening circle of attention. Because before the evidence could speak clearly, investigators needed to understand what had happened after Jessica vanished from view. And that required confronting the moment when normal life broke apart, quietly, decisively, and without witnesses. The answers, they believed, were waiting in the evidence she left behind. The shift from concern to certainty did not happen all at once. It happened in stages. First, there was silence. Friends noticed that Jessica was no longer responding the way she normally did. Calls went unanswered. Messages sat unread. In a city that never stops moving, absence can be easy to miss. But this absence felt different. Jessica was not someone who disappeared without explanation. She kept routines. She followed through. When she went quiet, there was usually a reason, and it was temporary. This time it wasn't. As investigators began reconstructing her final hours, they focused on establishing a clear timeline. Not speculation, not assumption, just sequence. Where she had been, who she had interacted with, what could be verified. They started with the last confirmed sightings. Jessica had been seen in the Houston area, moving through familiar spaces. Nothing out of the ordinary. No reports of distress. No visible signs that she was in trouble. That normalcy mattered, because it suggested that whatever happened next did not announce itself in advance. From there, the trail narrowed quickly. Her phone activity stopped. Her financial accounts showed no further use. No travel records appeared. No indication of a voluntary departure emerged. In missing person cases, investigators look for disruption, a sudden break in patterns. Jessica's life showed exactly that. Clean break, no gradual fading, just an abrupt stop. That kind of silence does not happen by accident. As the investigation progressed, forensic attention turned toward what could be learned from her body once it was recovered. When Jessica was found, the condition of her remains made one fact unavoidable. This was not a medical event. It was not an accident. And it was not self-inflicted. An autopsy was performed by Dr. David Dolinak, a forensic pathologist with extensive experience in determining cause and manner of death. His findings would become central to the case. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. In plain terms, that conclusion meant that Jessica's airway had been deliberately obstructed. This was not something that could occur without direct physical action by another person. There was no ambiguity in that determination. The medical evidence was clear. Strangulation also told investigators something else. It required proximity. It required sustained contact. It required time. Unlike other forms of violence, strangulation does not happen in a single instant. It unfolds over moments that cannot be mistaken for anything else. That fact reframed the investigation again, away from impulse and toward intent. Investigators examined the surrounding circumstances carefully. They documented where Jessica had been left. They analyzed the scene for signs of movement, placement, and effort. The evidence suggested that she had been assaulted and then abandoned, left behind after the violence had already occurred. There were no signs of an attempt to seek help afterward. No indication she regained consciousness. No evidence of a delayed medical crisis. The timeline collapsed inward. The crime, investigators believed, happened in a narrow window, after Jessica was last seen alive, and before she vanished completely from contact. Attention returned, inevitably, to those who had access during that window. Crispin Harmel's name resurfaced not through theory, but through overlap. His proximity aligned with the timeline investigators were building. His connection to Jessica placed him within the circle of opportunity, and as detectives pressed for clarity, inconsistencies began to matter. Statements were compared. Movements were cross-referenced. Details were tested against physical findings. This was not about catching someone in a lie for its own sake. It was about whether the story being told could coexist with the evidence already established. In court proceedings that followed, prosecutors would argue that it could not. They laid out how the medical findings contradicted any benign explanation, how the nature of Jessica's injuries pointed to deliberate violence, how the circumstances of where she was found suggested abandonment, not rescue or confusion. The defense would later challenge interpretations. They would question intent. They would argue alternative readings of evidence. But the autopsy findings remained fixed. Strangulation does not happen by chance. By the time charges were filed, the investigation had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about whether a crime had occurred. That question had been answered definitively. What remained unresolved, at least for the moment, was how a moment of familiarity had turned fatal, and how responsibility would be assigned in a courtroom rather than at a crime scene. The evidence had spoken clearly. Now, the legal system would decide what to do with it. By the time the case reached its legal phase, the central question was no longer whether Jessica Callagher had been killed. That had already been established. The question was how the justice system would interpret the evidence, and whether it could meet the burden required to hold someone criminally responsible beyond a reasonable doubt. Crispin Harmel was charged in connection with Jessica's death, facing serious allegations that included capital murder and related offenses. The charges reflected the gravity of the forensic findings and the investigative conclusions drawn from them. They also reflected how the state viewed the sequence of events, not as a momentary lapse, but as a chain of deliberate actions that began with restraint and ended with abandonment. The legal process moved forward deliberately. In court, prosecutors centered their case on medical evidence. They did not rely on speculation. They did not rely on emotional appeal. Instead, they returned repeatedly to what could be proven: the autopsy findings, the cause of death, and the physical realities of strangulation. Medical testimony explained, in plain language, what the body revealed: that the injuries were consistent with sustained pressure, that the manner of death required proximity and force, that it could not be reconciled with an accident or an unexplained medical collapse. This framing mattered, because in a courtroom, certainty must be built piece by piece. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation. They questioned conclusions. They pressed for alternative explanations. They scrutinized the timeline and the inferences drawn from it. This is how the adversarial system works: not to find comfort but to test strength. The case did not resolve cleanly. Procedural issues, evidentiary disputes, and appellate considerations led to a retrial. That outcome did not erase the findings. It did not change the medical conclusions. But it did reset the legal process, placing the case back into motion rather than allowing it to settle. For Jessica's family, that distinction carried weight. A retrial is not closure. It is continuation. It is waiting again. It means revisiting details already lived through, hearing timelines repeated, seeing evidence examined once more. The legal system asks for patience, even when grief has already exhausted it. As the case proceeded through retrial, Jessica's death remained the constant at its center. The court would ultimately determine accountability within the bounds of law, but the facts of her loss were never in dispute. Jessica Callagher was 27 years old. She was not defined by the charges filed after her death, or by the complexity of the courtroom process that followed. She was defined by the life she lived before it ended, by her presence, her relationships, and the ordinary future that was taken from her. Her case stands as a reminder of how fragile certainty can be once it enters the legal system. Evidence can be clear, conclusions can be firm, and still, outcomes can remain unsettled for years. That does not mean the truth disappears. It means the path to accountability is not always straight. For those who remember Jessica, the legacy is not found in verdicts alone. It is found in persistence, in the refusal to allow her story to be reduced to a procedural footnote or a stalled headline. Unresolved does not mean forgotten, and ongoing does not mean insignificant. Jessica's name remains part of the record because her life mattered, regardless of how long the legal process takes to reach its end. If you're still watching, you need to see this case next.